Now, talking about Florida, a Florida mother has been sentenced to a month in prison and 3 months of home confinement for stealing and selling the diary of President Joe Biden's daughter, Ashley, to Project Veritas. Josh, incredible that with the media seems more interested in how Project Veritas got the diary than they are with the contents of this diary, which, as far as I know, have not been denied. In this diary, Ashley explores why she was, and I quote, hypersexualized at a young age, referencing being sexualized, having sex with friends at a young age. And most concerning of all, she wrote about showers with my dad, probably not appropriate. What can you tell us about this diary and the case that's just been finalised in Manhattan?
Yeah, I can't imagine why the mainstream media would try to avoid a juicy diary where you have a member of the Biden family
Mhm.
talking about showering with the big guy himself, Joe Biden. Look, Joe Biden's been around the block. He's been a fixture of US politics for roughly a half century or so. There have been so many times over the years where you see him awkwardly very awkwardly patting young girls on
Oh,
the head,
yes.
sniffing them. I hesitate to use the word perverted, but frankly, it's hard to avoid it when you look at a lot of the clips over the years as to how this man acts when he is around women who happen to be a lot younger than he is. Apparently, it includes those who share his last name, Biden, as well. Project Veritas, which unfortunately is a shell of what it once was, the organization and James O'Keefe had a bit of a falling out, but they did tremendous work when they were in operation. James O'Keefe himself was actually
Hmm.
pinned to the floor of his own house by the FBI back in 2021, 2022 for various other exploits, very much including the Ashley Biden journal diary saga there. So they have paid a significant price there. Ultimately, it amounts to a war on the First Amendment, a war on journalistic freedom here, and just another example, as if we needed another example of the state wielding power to punish its enemies in a deeply ideological way.
And can you imagine if this was Ivanka's diary and she had written this about Donald Trump? It would be the biggest story in the world. Everyone would be across that story. And there would be so many Americans who aren't even across this, despite the existence of this diary and Project Veritas. Publishing parts of it. Now, let's talk about trust in the national public radio broadcaster. That's plummeted. Our own ABC should take note of this next story. One of the stalwarts there, Yuri Berliner, who's worked at NPR for 25 years, wrote a scathing piece for the Free Press outlining how the network has lost its way and lost the trust of its audience. He writes, concerned by the lack of viewpoint diversity, I looked at voter registration for our newsroom in DC, where NPR is headquartered and many of us live. I found 87 registered Democrats working in editorial positions and zero Republicans, none. And Josh, I've got to say, it shows, and as a taxpayer funded media outlet, it has an obligation to be neutral, and it certainly is not, just like our ABC and SBS here in Australia.
Right. So it's the taxpayer funded nature of NPR that has always been problematic. And this has always been the reason that many Republican politicians have sought to defund it. Hopefully this article that Yuri Berliner, to his great credit, went ahead and did publicly under his own name. By the way, an aside, read, it'll be very interesting to see how long he lasts. I mean, will he be actually out of a job next
Yeah.
week at NPR after this whole tell all story that he published at Barry Weiss's Free Press? That's a very interesting story in and of itself there. But one data point that I saw in his article today that I thought was fascinating is that he goes back to as recently as 2012, which was the presidential election cycle where Mitt Romney lost to Barack Obama. In 2012, the NPR readership was only about 11 percentage more Democrat than Republican. Then you fast forward it to the present day, it's like 55 to 60% more Democrat than Republican. So, what is going on there when it comes to the readership and the listenership? It's happened over a very short, compressed time. And I think the obvious answer, Rita, which we see playing across all of American media for the most part, other than a few stalwarts, for the most part, it's just Trump derangement syndrome. It is a post 2016, post
Yeah.
Trump phenomenon. NPR has been the tip of that spear, unfortunately.
It has, and it's ironic that this station that prides itself on diversity and tracks the potential job candidates there, their race, their gender, identity, all sorts of diversity and equity inclusion staff have been pushed up the ranks. And yet you look at its audience and it's overwhelmingly white, affluent, urban. They really do not actually serve the diversity of America. Only 6% of their audience is black. And when you look at the population, 14% is black. Similar with the Hispanic population, only 7% of their audience is Hispanic, when Hispanics make up around 19% of the population. So there's some really interesting takeouts there. And NPR's response has been to basically bury its head in the sand. In a letter to staff, the acting chief content officer said, "I and my colleagues on the leadership team strongly disagree with Uri's assessment of the quality of our journalism and the integrity of our newsroom processes." Yeah, okay. Whatever. Let's talk about housing affordability. This is an issue that's big in the US. It's big right here in Australia, but it's an issue that's really worsened under the Biden administration. This is something Turning Point USA's Charlie Kirk explained recently.
I'm looking right now towards like my future, and I'm really having a hard time really seeing myself being able to do the same things like my parents have done, such as buy a house at a young age and whatnot. Do you think there's going to be any change in the housing market?
It's a great question. So 4 years ago, the average income to be able to buy a home in this country was $59,000 a year. Now it requires $106,000 a year to buy a home. You have been robbed by the DC political class, and then big corporations like BlackRock come in and purchase these homes and then rent them back to you.
Josh, how much of an issue is this in the lead up to the presidential election? I know you've got some massive issues there: illegal immigration, the entire cost of living inflation, the crime, but surely young people being priced out of the housing market has so many long-term consequences.
Yeah, I mean, this is a massive issue, Rita, and I was happy to see that Turning Point USA was covering it. And Charlie, by the way, in his answer there is exactly right to point a big finger at BlackRock and other major institutional investors. You know, BlackRock and other like-minded financial institutions are buying up tons and tons of residential property across America. In fact, there's actually a very interesting recent law that passed in Texas, my former state there. It was signed into law by Governor Greg Abbott that would actually limit the amount of purely residential property that large institutional investors and buyers like BlackRock can buy. And, you know, some people might look at that and say, oh, you're impinging upon free market. They can do whatever they want. But you know, there's something to be said for good old-fashioned common sense, frankly. And in a time like this, where Gen Z and millennials are struggling more than their parents' generation and their grandparents' generation to get that first home, I'm a millennial. I'm only 35 years old. I mean, I know that acute pain very much firsthand there. It's really tough out there, and it's doubly tough given the fact that the Federal Reserve is talking about potentially actually kicking interest rates even higher as inflation continues to still be stubborn. It's very, very unfortunate right now, but I think the housing market, Rita, is one of the #1 issues, probably why Biden is actually hemorrhaging support among millennials and Gen Z. He's currently polling within a 10-point margin when it comes to the 18 and 35 demographic. From a Democratic Party standpoint, that's not going to cut it. He needs that number way up.
Oh, absolutely. The numbers there in successive polls would be very disturbing to the Democrats indeed. Josh Hammer, thank you so much for your time this evening.